I want to greet all of you and thank you very much for coming to the December 2009 Labor Breakfast Forum sponsored by New Labor Forum and the Murphy Institute. Okay, Greg, I want to just acknowledge Paula Finn, the editor of New Labor Forum, and now Greg Mancios. It is a breakfast, so that's what he was doing. Greg is the director of the Joseph S. Murphy Institute for Worker Education and Labor Studies, and Katie Krupak is the associate director who handles the worker education programs. I'm just going to take a few minutes to make a couple introductory remarks and then turn the floor over to our distinguished panelists. It really was quite fortuitous that the Murphy Institute and New Labor Forum should have planned a labor breakfast forum on the Great Recession and the battle for good jobs in the black community a day after President Obama convened a White House summit on jobs creation. I don't know whether the administration did that once it saw the notice for this event or not. Now, while I need not recite a host of statistics associated with what is now called the Great Recession, it is relevant to our discussion this morning to note that from the fourth quarter of 2007 through the third quarter of this year, our economy has shed nearly 2 million jobs. And that while the overall unemployment rate still tops 10%, I didn't hear the latest newscast, so I don't know exactly how that rounds off. They're announcing the new statistics this morning. It is 1.5 times that among African Americans, much higher still among African American males, and at depression levels among African Americans aged 18 to 24. Since the Bureau of Labor Statistics first began compiling this sort of data, African American unemployment has consistently outstripped the jobless rates among whites. Indeed, as one of our panelists, Stephen Pitts, has demonstrated in his brilliantly documented report entitled Job Quality in Black Workers, a Multi-City Report, these figures demonstrate that the massive hemorrhaging of jobs occurs on an uneven foundation of historically entrenched, racially segregated labor markets. And as you will shortly hear from Mr. Pitts, it is not only a question of the availability of jobs, but also what kinds of jobs are available to African Americans. For that question draws our attention to a second aspect of the historic and ongoing discrimination that African Americans face. All of this poses serious policy challenges related to the recovery from the current recession. There's much talk about a jobless recovery. It is important to understand that that is a relative concept. Jobless recovery doesn't mean that no jobs will be created, but that job creation will be sparse compared to the number of jobs lost and the number of jobs the economy needs to generate to restore employment rates to pre-recession levels, as well as stay even with the ongoing growth of the workforce. In point of fact, we could be talking about the creation of millions of jobs in a jobless recession. Whether the recovery is robust or jobless, the question is twofold. Who gets a fair share of whatever number of jobs the economy manages to generate, and who gets a just proportion of the good jobs created within that overall context? Now, conventional wisdom, adhered to by conservative and sometimes even liberal policymakers and politicians, has it that a rising tide raises all boats. Admittedly, that is bound to be true to some extent, but without concerted and concentrated effort, will a rising tide raise the boats that have already sunk? Answering that question belongs to the realm of public policy and government intervention. Defying conventional wisdom, indeed exposing its hypocrisy through devastating documentation and policy advocacy on behalf of the poor, the underrepresented, the denied, has been a lifetime avocation of our other speaker, David Jones, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Community Service Society of New York. In the obtaining situation, it is necessary to ask, what is government doing or not doing? It is necessary to pose such a challenge even of a friendly administration. And while fitting and proper to pursue, even demand governmental action, the Obama administration is not the only player on the field. What are other institutions doing, including labor unions, labor federations, central labor councils, and union activists? What is labor doing to address and ameliorate the widely manifest disparities and inequalities that our speakers will address this morning? Where are labor's innovative policy proposals and practical initiatives? Beyond pronouncements and press conferences, what is labor doing politically and organizationally to eliminate barriers to African American job market participation? Indeed, this question should be asked across the board to civil rights organizations, educational institutions, foundations, religious denominations, worker centers, and community-based organizations. And finally, we should all come together to try to answer one more query. How should recovery efforts be shaped to address the challenge of providing work and good jobs for unemployed and underemployed African Americans whose boats sunk or are sinking under a tidal wave of exclusion, globalization, policy indifference, rhetorical hypocrisy, and political insensitivity? Now, I do not know, well, actually I do, whether Stephen Pitts or David Jones attended the White House summit yesterday, because I just asked David a couple minutes ago. If they were not, they should have been. And at any rate, their voices, insights, policy proposals, activism will be heard as the nation proceeds in tackling the task of ensuring that the recovery is a recovery for all. It is my pleasure, and probably yours, to step aside and yield the podium to this morning's panelists. They will speak in the order in which I introduced them, and that will be followed by our usual question and answer exchange. First will be Stephen A. Pitts, who, as I said, is author of Job Quality in Black Workers, a multi-city report, and a labor policy specialist at the Center for Labor Research and Education at the University of California at Berkeley, a notable free speech tradition. Mr. Pitt's academic work and activism have focused on union leadership development programs and job quality and labor's role in the Black community. In 2006, he designed and was the lead instructor for the annual C.L. Dellum's African American Union Leadership School, which graduated its 4th class just this past May. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard College and both a master's and a PhD in economics from the University of Houston. David Jones has as impressive a resume as you will find among public servants. Under his guidance, the Community Service Society has become one of the most influential and consequential social service institutions in the nation. But rather than detail his biography further, because you can go to the CSS website, and it will take you a while. Let me just say that David is a highly respected national leader on issues of urban policy, poverty, and economic development. He is a coalition builder. He works for consensus and is unafraid to step out or speak out when necessary. He believes in combining social science research with policy advocacy. He believes in moving in circles at the top with mobilizing from below. I had the honor of working for David in 1989 on Countdown 89, a nonpartisan voter registration drive that registered nearly 50,000 voters here in New York City, and working with him on the 2005 State of the African American Male Conference hosted by CSS and the 4 New York and New Jersey members of the Congressional Black Caucus. So, gentlemen, the podium is yours. Stephen?
Good morning. It's really good morning. As you know, it's really 6 o'clock right now. I'm back in California. And for the most part, I tell people I don't really bother by the whole jet lag thing. I don't sleep full 8 hours, but I got in last night around maybe 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. I'm in good shape because 6:30, let's roll. It's a good time. I'm comfortable back West Coast. All of a sudden, 2:30, I ought to go to bed now, shouldn't I? All of a sudden, oh my God, it's 6:30 in the morning. It's kind of a mess, isn't it? So I'm kind of groggy, but it should be okay. But I'm really glad to be here. In some ways, and we're kind of the West Coast version of what happens here at CUNY, at the Labor Center at UC Berkeley. We've been around almost 40 years now. It's 45 years now, and we can kind of fight the good fight, do a lot of training and research on labor issues, and I kind of span both wings of what we do at the Labor Center, some research, as James mentioned, and some trainings as well. And we're happy to say that we're starting our 5th class of our Black Union Leadership School in February, and I'm really excited about that, because the idea is we do need more Black union leaders, and we do what we can to help push folks through the process. Also, I try to do some research as well, but I call my research kind of framing research, in the sense that I'm trying to see what we can do to help shift and change the debate. Because in my mind, the real problem isn't the lack of data, it's lack of power. And so if you have to, I can run a regression for you. But the problem is that people know the problem. The problem is we don't have the power to change the world itself. I was in a meeting about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and people discussed an interesting sort of kind of linkage of things that's important to us. People mentioned projects, policies, and power. And all 3 are important. We need projects to kind of give a sense of what's possible in the world. And we need policies to take those projects and bring them to scale, to help people we care about. But most fundamentally, we need power to change the world. And without that, we can't get those scalable projects. And I mention it because I get really frustrated I'll call it the DC policy world. I'm in New York now, so in the New York policy world, I call it the DC policy world. I get very frustrated because if you think about it, end of the day, policies involve cutting a deal. You count votes, you cut a deal, you go forward. But if in the course of doing that, you don't find ways to build our capacity, we keep cutting deals that aren't good for our folk. And so more and more I want to keep pushing on the ideas, how do we, in the course of fighting the day-to-day fight, how do we find ways to build our capacity? So next time around we cut a deal, we cut a better deal. And so when I think about our research that we do, I call it framing research. And I have kind of the pre-recession story, okay? That really, we need to expand the review, the jobs crisis in the Black community. I think while we correctly look at the issue of unemployment, and clearly it's a greater problem now than it was, say, 2 years ago, if we only look at the issue of unemployment, we miss a big part of the story, because Black folks also work. And we work, but they're in poor jobs and bad jobs. And so we talk more and more about having a two-dimensional job crisis, the real crises of unemployment, but also the very real crises of low-wage work. And I'm clear that if you don't look at both those things, if you only focus on one element, the unemployment issue, you'll do a disservice to both things. Because you'll be trying to get people out of work into bad jobs, which isn't our goal, and they won't stay there. And we have kind of this narrative about kind of racial algebra, showing my age, I guess, racial algebra stories, right? That someone starts in the mail room and works up to the top. That narrative is nice, but isn't real, okay? The reality is that for a lot of working class folk in high school, in Detroit, what did you do in the old days? You got a job in the factories there. You stayed there 30, 40 years. There wasn't any sort of rising up to running GM. Or in Chicago, my hometown, you got a job maybe in the steel mills or meat packing. It wasn't any sort of elevator up to the top. It's this notion they got to start someplace. Well, folk got to pay the bills, y'all, okay? I'm not against paying bills. But the idea that it's sufficient is simply not correct. And the idea someone could get there and they'll find their way further is not correct, especially in today's society. So we got to talk about both issues of the problem, the unemployment problem, but also the low-wage work problem itself. Now, how you apply that kind of frame is different. And today's really a different situation. Given that, I have kind of some things to talk about. I'm used to kind of walking around, having PowerPoints and those sort of things, but Paula said, no PowerPoints. So no, you did, I asked you. Don't kind of say, no, you know you did. Okay. It's innocent person mix. She said no PowerPoints. And so, but I do want to talk about 20 minutes or so about some things, and hopefully have a great conversation after David talks as well. And I had a long title for my talk and got crunched down, but it began by saying that we got to restructure the Jericho Road. And that's kind of the big heading for the talk itself. And it refers back to what Martin King mentioned a lot. And I want to give you a little quote. And the quote's from really his speech at the Riverside Church here, back on April 4th, the year before he died in '67. And while it's called Beyond Vietnam, it's kind of an important topic given we should be beyond Afghanistan. That's another conversation of the talk, right? It's this really important sort of thing he said at the end. He said a true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not constantly be beaten and robbed as they make their journey along life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces begging must be restructured. And that's our starting point, okay? That we have an economy that produces, for many, many people, if they have a job, bad jobs, low-wage jobs, and that can't be sustained. And so we talk about a job summit yesterday in DC or going forward, we got to talk about not just putting people to work, but changing the structure of our, you could call it a U.S. jobs machine. As I mentioned before, sometimes in our trainings we talk about winning and building. That when we go forward in our activities, we have to win today because people want to win and live better. But in the course of that winning, we have to build for tomorrow. And we need a kind of dual way of looking at the world. We are both trying to fight for today and improve the world today, but also trying to find ways to expand capacity so we can have better victories tomorrow as well. And that should be kind of the way we look at things. Kind of four things kind of drive what I want to mention today. One is it's kind of obvious. We do exist in a racially stratified labor market. And we won't get off into like, was November 8 a good thing and are we missing race, those kind of things. Obviously we have a racially stratified society here, still exists, will exist for a long time. I had a friend of mine who does some work around affirmative action contracting, and she was interviewing some white contractors, and someone said, because they're in New York, where they're saying, well, we have Obama as president, we have Patterson governor, we don't need affirmative action. Okay, so, well, that's an interesting way to look at the world. People are racially stratified. Other important things, we are moving from formerly the Great Recession to a jobless recovery. And we'll talk a bit more about what it actually means itself. It means that given that we need to find policies that both spur economic growth and job creation, but it has to target the most disadvantaged. The notion of having these kind of colorblind policies won't work. So discuss that a bit as well. But lastly, that I'm going to kind of talk a bit more about, given my inclinations, is that part of the road forward is building more power in the black community. And from my vantage point in California, which is clearly skewed because it's kind of this strange area out there, especially in the Bay Area in particular, but there seems to be this kind of gap between what I'll call kind of the progressive social justice community, which I mean non-black social justice community, and the black community, this gap here. It's almost a fundamental disconnect. And if we maintain the disconnect, both movements aren't served well. So I want to speak about that, the need to really rebuild progressive black power also. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. I don't want to talk a lot about kind of the current jobs program, because, I mean, we can go to EPI website or CCC website and see what we need to do to change things around. Given time, I don't want to talk about what unions ought to do. A little bit, but not a whole lot, because I have 20 minutes, not a couple hours, okay? But we can get that in some of the questions and answers. First, the Great Recession, kind of a context. Don't know the numbers today. I'm sure they were not that great, right? But make sure we're clear. If we look at starting the recession back in December 2007, for the last 22 months, we've lost really 7.3 million jobs, which is huge. 7.3 million jobs are gone since the beginning of the recession, December 2007. Now, clearly someone say, well, hey, it's a bigger economy, so what? Okay, we can examine the percent change, the percentage of the total workforce. And that loss, that 7.3 million jobs, translates into 5.3% of all jobs. That's a huge chunk, 5.3%. And that's the biggest since the Great Depression. That's why we can't call this a recession, it's a Great Recession. It's the biggest ever. Given how we kind of formally define a recession, we may be heading out of it. I know Krugman had a column yesterday saying, 2 days ago, saying maybe a double dip coming. Well, we'll find out when it dips again, okay? But if we don't have a double dip, I mean, it's clear we're gonna have a jobless recovery. And give you a sense of what that means by having a jobless recovery. If we examine kind of the 6 or so recessions between World War II and 1990, so not including the 1990 recession up until then, and we examine how deep the job loss was, on average, and we examine how long it took to recover, meaning how long it took to recover to the pre-recession levels of job levels. On average, the job loss was 2.4%. Once again, we examine the recessions, World War II to right before 1990. The average job loss, 2.4%. The time it took to recover to the pre-recession level was around 20 months. Okay, that's kind of typical until 1990. In the 1990 recession, the job loss wasn't as great, but 1.4%. In 2001, the job loss was about 2%. So it wasn't quite as deep as the other ones, right? But if you think about the time it took to recover, in 1990, it took 30 months to get back to the pre-recession level. Far, far more than the typical average up to that point in time. The recession in 2001, the other Bush recession, they call these Bush recessions now, right? The other Bush recession. That time, once again, it wasn't a deep recession, 2% job loss across the board. It took 46 months to recover, okay? So we see kind of this recent phenomenon where we have these recessions taking longer and longer to recover. That's a jobless recovery. Once again, we see right now a 5.3% reduction in jobs, a major drop-off, and we don't know how long it will take to recover. We can say it's 20 months and counting, people, okay? And so the fear, once again, is that when we do end the official recession, we'll have a long jobless recovery. People are talking about the best analogy is Japan in kind of the 1990s. They call it a lost decade, basically. That's the idea, that we can have a decade of very, very poor growth. It's just a major, major concern. So what is needed? Well, it's clear that the first stimulus package was too small, okay? It was too much geared towards tax cuts. This crazy notion, people, that just give a business a tax cut and to create jobs. Well, I want to sell stuff, y'all, personally, if I'm a business person. If folk I'm buying, I ain't producing, right? If folk I'm buying, I won't produce, I won't hire anybody. So this focus on tax cuts is insane. It may be politically needed, given a lack of political power, which is back to the first point. The issue is not policy, it's power, people, okay? The less power you have, the worse the deal you're going to cut. And some people say we need tax cuts, so we can't fight them politically, we need tax cuts. But in the real world, people need income to spend. And when they spend, folk will find ways to hire folk, y'all, they will. We also need more money given to the states. I'm from California, I need a job. Many California in particular, okay, in particular. But the issue is what, let me make sure we're clear, people, that because of the requirement for states to balance budgets, the state begins to counteract what happens on the federal level. It's like 2 steps forward, federal stimulus, 1 step back because the states are raising taxes or cutting spending. That's very important and needed as well. But it's also important to know that when we talk about job creation, it's important that we have that. We talk about aids to the states, we talk about a new stimulus package, that isn't sufficient. It truly isn't. Ira Cass Nelson has a wonderful title in his book, When Affirmative Action Was White. It was an incredible title, right? Guess what, y'all? We had this kind of society for a long time. His idea was what? New Deal, for all its wonderful things, is an example of affirmative action for white folks. It wasn't always said it directly, but the reality is what happened. And so you wonder, how did it happen? Well, one, if you think about it, in the New Deal programs, they kind of restricted some benefits away from areas where blacks were. And so when you talk about the expansion of social safety net and the idea of being able to organize, we didn't allow for domestic workers to organize. They went in the 35 of the Wagner Act. Well, who were domestics? Well, we were, right? Oh my God, I forgot about those folks, right? But also it's a matter of oftentimes in the New Deal, they allowed to have local control of the programs. Okay, y'all, you're Mississippi, local control. Well, God, well, guess what happened there, y'all, okay? And so you have these kind of programs that either explicitly ignored people of color or allow you to have sort of local control without any sort of anti-discrimination policies, and we have, once again, white affirmative action. So it says that when you have a racially stratified society, you can't have race-neutral policies and address the problem. It won't work. And it doesn't matter how well-intentioned people are, it won't work. One, unfortunately, incredibly durable fact, if you look at kind of the ratio of black unemployment to white unemployment, it has stayed basically 2 to 1 for 50 years, y'all. Good times, 2 to 1. Bad times, 2 to 1. In between times, 2 to 1. It's consistent, 2 to 1. And to talk about having an expansion and a job creation package doesn't recognize that. You're going to have a green economy at 2 to 1, y'all. I guarantee you, okay? And so it's very important when we talk about having ways to address the racially stratified policies as well. So some other quick things. I hate data, but I'll give you some data real quickly. One thing we're doing, with kind of my previous session story, we're trying to examine what we call kind of the place-based industries. In other words, I think one problem how we look at the issue of globalization, it tends to disempower us. It tends to immobilize us. We say that, oh my God, if we do anything, it's going to go to China or Japan or South Africa, someplace. And the narrative says, well, just train folk, they'll be okay. Give them a degree. Well, now that won't be the solution, y'all. But the reality is that when you talk about kind of the current globalization, we call corporate globalization, you have both job loss. Some jobs are going overseas. But we also have job creation. Jobs are here. Some jobs are relatively place-based. And people, if jobs are place-based and they have less susceptibility to outsourcing, the story is no longer how do you move somebody from that job. The story is how do you transform that job? How do you make a job in healthcare or in security or in hospitality, a better job? And we talk a lot about getting folk into good jobs. Construction, right? Those were always good jobs, y'all, okay? They were good jobs because they were organized. And you were able to take a market, tackle it, make it good. And so once again, the idea is to find those sectors that are fairly place-based and raise the question, not how do we move people from point A to point B, but how do you take a job, make it better? And so we're trying to get a sense of this idea of, well, let's examine these place-based industries. Let's find out what's the black presence there. Talk about, well, guess what? There's going to be racially stratified markets there. So we have black folks in jobs that are fairly place-based. and getting low wages, and those are growth industries, the story should be, well, if our folk are going to be there, and they're going to make bad wages, y'all, how do we make those industries better? So we're trying to do a little research on that. Should come out maybe in January, maybe who knows, it'll come out soon, hopefully. But what's interesting, by the way, we see a little gender slant there. That we really see that black women are more in those kind of place-based industries than black men. And so some quick sort of numbers. We use someone else's way of measuring kind of place-basedness, okay? But you do see that if we examine those place-based industries and we examine the issue of who's in the lowest third of the jobs there, the black women are more impacted than black men. A quick story, some examples, by the way. Look at education sector. This is looking at data 2005, 2007. 11.8% of black women had jobs in education, fairly place-based industry. 42% of those black women were in the lowest third of all jobs paid. An example, once again, of a place-based industry, wage inequality. How do we improve that? That's education and social services people. Looking at healthcare, 27.7% of black women were in that industry. Of black women in healthcare, social services, over half were in the lowest third. If here's parity, it'd be 1/3, right? It's not parity. So there's an example, once again, that if we're looking at taking care of black women, the issue isn't training out of these places. It's how do we find ways to improve those industries. Now, black men didn't have the same sort of concentration. I mentioned that for black women, healthcare, 27%. For black men, it's only around 8%. And I mentioned once again how for black women, half of all black women healthcare were in the lowest third. For black men, it's only 41%. Still a disproportion, right? But a different sort of slant there. So it was finding some interesting slants on this whole question of place-based industries. Inside those industries, wage inequality by gender. Just some thoughts. But the idea, though, the larger issue was this notion of we got to shift the discussion to go beyond just job training. We got to shift the discussion to go beyond just an individual and talk about how we transform context. People make choices. People need to be empowered. People need skills. But they make choices. They apply those skills in a context. And you give me skills in a bad context, I have a bad outcome, guaranteed, y'all. Okay? So the idea is to shift the focus, to expand beyond just individuals, to examine larger contextual issues as well. I mentioned kind of this disconnect between the progressive community, which is really the non-black progressive community, and the black community. Well, for my terms, I use kind of the socioeconomic justice movement and the racial justice movement, for lack of better terms. And I was thinking about it some, doing a little bit of research, and I thought about why we have a disconnect. If you examine kind of the traditional progressive policy around economic justice, it's focused on kind of three things. On worker organizing, how do you use public policy to leverage better labor standards, but also how do you use public policy to get more equitable development outcomes, the community benefit screens, right? That's kind of the idea. Find card check, get neutrality in the job, find ways to have living wage laws, to increase labor standards, find ways to have some sort of equitable distribution of development projects. That's the focus. But if you examine kind of regular black folks. I'm not a regular black folks, okay? Jobs. They say we need more jobs. They say we need really to fight discrimination. And we need job training. That's a disconnect, y'all. People aren't talking to one another. And that's a very important thing. It's important because, I mean, if you go back into kind of black history, an important concept was kind of race men, race women. Folk were kind of just down for the race, down for the cause, militant anti-racist folk. Now, back in the 30s and 40s, that strata of the black men, that kind of very race-conscious strata, they aligned with kind of left labor folk because the Communist Party were fiercely anti-racist. So it's kind of blending the two, didn't you? But given the whole McCarthy period, and other changes, while you still have that kind of race-conscious strata, they're no longer that linked to the labor left. The disconnect. And the issue is how to restore that connection. And when kind of the non-black progressive community forgets about race, men and women, and wonders implicitly what's wrong with those folk, you're no longer having strategic alliances with the black community become tactical. It's on a campaign by campaign basis. And that sort of thing won't work. And so it's important in trying to merge the two movements to strengthen both outcomes, to have better worker justice and better racial justice, to bring us two together. I've also want to write this little essay called Rashid Needs a Union, okay? And then in another article, Rashid and Roxanne Need a Union, okay? Kind of get a legitimate balance here. And I say it because what I find in talking to some of my friends in the Bay Area, folk acting in the black community, they say, yeah, unions, but. Yeah, but. And the but is because of some sense of history, which has been really nasty with unions, some sense of today, which can be nasty also. But my thing is this, people, if folk understand that outside the workplace, you need to come together and organize collectively to change the world, to fight racism. If you're talking about getting black folks better outcomes in the workplace, and you apply the same idea, you end up at union job, you get there, right? What's the problem? You need better wages. What's the context? You fight on the job. What do? You fight collectively. That's a union. And so the notion, people, should be that if you only care about a black kid who may or might do well in high school, and you care about what happens to them on the job, you have to say central, key to their advancement in life is a union. And at that point, unions are part of the family. They might be part of a crazy uncle in the attic you want to ignore sometimes, right? Okay, want to shoot him sometime, want to slap him sometime, even slap him sometime too, right? But at the end of the day, they're part of the family. And that has to be the attitude inside the black community if the question is helping black kids. Because otherwise what happens, you're resorting to saying, we need policies, devoted power, which won't serve them. Or you're resulting in saying, let's get them better schooling, which is important, people. Once again, if you put people in bad context, they have bad results. Let me stop there. I'm giving time. Also, it's funny, my notes are over there, by the way, so I can't get them, okay? But I am almost done. That was sort of thing, And the main thing I was going to say, and seriously, was that going back to that idea of restructuring the Jericho Road, that we need to look at our society, look at our jobs machine we have in our economy as a Jericho Road. And we can't simply put band-aids on that. Because this Jericho Road is racially stratified. We've got to have color conscious policies to address that and change the fundamental. And then we have a great conversation. Thanks a lot for your time.
Actually, following Stephen is going to be difficult. I'm not, by any means, an academic on these kinds of issues. But I think he's provided a rather perfect frame for some of the discussion I'd like to have with you. I'm coming from it, obviously, running a not-for-profit that deals with poverty in the city of New York. We've dealt with it for a long time. We're about 163 years old. And we founded a lot of the institutions you know in New York. And interestingly enough, it's around, basically, we talk about white welfare. CSS is really all about that. We founded the Columbia School of Social Work in reaction to the issues of European immigration coming through, the hospital of surgery to deal with ruptured and crippled children, basically the new immigrant populations, a whole range of issues and support was coming out of the essentially establishment of New York City to deal with the issues of a growing number of very poor people concentrated in the city of New York, and not out of any great favor to the poor. Let me be honest. I've read through the documents. They were afraid of social disorder. They were afraid of infectious disease. They were afraid of losing political clout because Tammany and the rest were organizing poor people rapidly, using relief and apartments to buy the vote. So my founders were pretty cynical people about why they were helping the poor. And I think there's some illusion of why a society helps the poor. I think you may look more to some of these issues of social controls and what problems emerge when a city like New York or Chicago or LA starts to have huge numbers of people who have no visible means of support, and you expect to maintain all the sort of nice lifestyle for the middle, upper class, and the rich of the city. And I think that pragmatic approach may help us as we start to define this. In a sense, Stephen has laid out, I think, two critical parts of this. What is the picture for unemployment going forward for a place like New York? And what implications does that have, particularly for blacks and Latinos? And secondarily, what role, if any, should American labor and New York labor have in dealing with the issue of the overconcentration of blacks and Latinos in low-wage work? And will they step up to actually raise the income levels and living standards of this population, which are overly concentrated at that end? Let me tell you sort of how we came to this. About 5 or 6 years ago, we issued a series of reports that have really defined not only the work we're doing locally, but have also started to insert us in some of the national debates. The first was an issue of a finding of black male participation rates, which discovered, and as many of you know here, it's not unemployment that counts, it's labor participation. And economists all over the place have begun looking at labor participation as the more valuable tool because basically unemployment only applies to workers or potential workers who are actively looking for work. Doesn't take into discouraged workers, doesn't take the young people, which is the engine of many of the problems in New York, who never even connect with the labor market. It doesn't take into account the fact that we have 23,000 individuals on probation at any time in the state of New York, and 63,000 incarcerated who are basically facing a kind of civil death. They basically never work again for whatever they say at Fortune and the rest. Essentially, we're constantly overwhelmed by people we incarcerate basically for nonviolent crimes under Rockefeller drug laws who never participate. This amalgam, as well as the people like me who reach serious middle age and have done work all their lives and suddenly have a back problem. And as a low-wage worker, forget it. You never get back into work after that. No employer is going to pick you up. This amalgam is what we started to unearth of the fact that barely 50% of black men at that time we looked, this was before the recession, were actively in the workforce. The second report was on something called disconnected youth. These are 16 to 24-year-olds. We happen to have the largest collection of that group anywhere in the country, but it's part of a 5 to 6 million person problem across the nation. It cuts across racial lines now. But we have about 175,000 16 to 24-year-olds who are not in work and school, and these are based on old figures now. So we haven't calculated yet the surge that we know that's going on because of this recession. And sort of the final report was actually commissioned for a labor union, for 32BJ, who were interested in looking at conditions for people who were security guards. This was the first commission CSS had ever undertaken for a labor union. We were very interested in starting to look at sector analysis, particularly because of the overconcentration of black and Latino men in this sector. And that report was a shock, I think, even to the more hardened of us. This is a 63,000 person workforce, no health insurance, no benefits, no sick days, no nothing, and virtually no unionization. And those sort of reports have framed a lot of my thinking and what I'd like to talk about here today. We have a chart. I think you saw it. I don't know if we can get it up. Gabrielle will help. That I think everyone saw, looking at black unemployment rates in the nation. It was on December 1st. Can we get it to work? We can hand it out if we can. So I've never been able to get a computer to work. Anyway, my kids, my son laughs at me visibly whenever I try. Oh, it's going to go. Let me go on as we struggle with this. Essentially, don't worry about it. We'll hand out the sheet. Essentially, the chart you may have seen showed that black men are now facing unemployment rates nationwide of about 24%, nearly double their white counterparts. This particularly for people without high school. And we have the highest concentrations. We estimate, last time we looked, we have about 1 million plus people in the city of New York, working age, who don't have high school education. It's not evenly distributed across the city. It's concentrated mainly among black and Latino workers, particularly prevalent by gender among males. That problem, that sort of sitting there, is going to have a drag on what's happening as the economy starts to recover. What we realized when we analyzed New York, this has not been a recession in New York City that's really equal opportunity. The estimates are that barely a fraction of a percentage point of people who have college haven't been able to find new work. When you get to people without high school, again, overwhelmingly black and Latino, the numbers skyrocket to 18%. We really drive the whole number of the over 10% unemployment rate within the city of New York. So we have these sort of skews. Everyone is worried about Wall Street, and isn't it terrible? People lost six-figure incomes, and it's devastating. Our mayor even suggested that we had to retool people who lost jobs on Wall Street. But in fact, we have a recession, and a great recession. That was not partisan, right? I didn't do anything over the top, not yet anyway. But we have a recession that's really of poor people with limited educational skills, and the likelihood that this recovery, already building on a lousy condition that we had picked up in the non-recessionary times, will further impoverish enormous numbers of people throughout New York, and particularly black men and women, and particularly those without high school. So basically, I'm not an academic. I never claimed to be. I started out as a litigator. I've been through so many different jobs. I'm starting to feel like Forrest Gump, even though I've had the last one for a long time. I jump around, but I think what we're up against is not stating the problem anymore. Okay, what are you going to do about fixing it? I have an old NAS cartoon showing Tammany mauling the public liberty. And there's a byline where Tweed is saying, so what are you going to do about it? We're going to get away with it. We have the power. And I think that's the more interesting discussion of what you're going to do about it, particularly in light of the president's summit. Because you saw the parameters of waiting around for a president, who we all voted for, I think, being expected to wave a magic wand and fix this. He's going to have to go towards the center. It is the responsibility of labor, and I'll talk about that, and the political leadership of the black and Latino and progressive communities to do something about it. And we're not dealing with no power. I think you're starting to see the understanding. We, many years ago, as part of our voter registration and other work, started to press when the charter reform was going on to ensure that districts were appropriately allocated in the new city council to start to reflect the actual demographics of New York. And the idea was we wanted to create a majority-minority city council. That happened this year, not because only us, a lot of efforts went into this. But the power hasn't fully come to rise. The potential is there. Similarly, you have 57 members of the Black Caucus in Washington, barely beginning to move and saying we're not going to vote unless things happen. And then we have American labor, which has enormous part in why this president was elected. And it too has to play its part if we're going to come up with solutions that have any relevance to the people we're trying to defend. Let me take them one at a time. I mean, we at CSS have tried to sort of step back and say, okay, we can state the problem. I can get my editorial, as we do periodically in the New York Times, and people can wring their hands. But if I don't come up with some approach that has some measurable and scalable impact on it, it's probably not worth it. And that's what we've been wrestling with now for 23 years, of what can you do from the vantage point of a small not-for-profit trying to deal with problems that way outstrip any local intervention. And I guess that's what led us down the road to some of the work we've been doing in Washington with others, some independently, some. When we started getting the numbers of black male labor participation rates and disconnected youth, my people came to me and said, for disconnected youth, we've looked at the programming interventions that work. It's 15,000 per person per year. I'm not good at math, but I come into my state legislature or my city council and say, well, we should start at a 100,000 pilot program, and that's only 100 or 150 million just to get started, and it doesn't really move the question. We recognize that as we particularly started to work on disconnected youth and other problems, that this is systemic throughout urban areas across America. If you go to Detroit, if you go to Michigan, if you go to LA, the same parameters of what's happened to black men and to disconnected youth of all races is happening across America. And interestingly enough, it's not only confined to black and Latino urban residents. As a matter of fact, the first sort of validation I got, I did an address before a group of editors of small and mid-sized papers for some bizarre reason. I don't know why they wanted to hear from me. And it was the Virginia Pilot that ran the lead editorial saying, yeah, we don't know about the problems Jones was talking about on urban poor, but our suburban community are literally being overwhelmed by young people with no high school completion and no way to get work anymore. This is a national problem we've linked up in, and basically it's still on the paradigm. There's no problem in America. If you drop out or you just don't make it at first, you'll find a job because we're a society that basically can trump anybody else. The globalization that Stephen talked about is exactly what it not only swept black and Latino urban dwellers, it's sweeping across America now. If you're not skilled and you're young, you really never participate in the economy effectively. And that is starting to have a devastating effect, obviously, on our communities, but I think it's the source of a lot of this right-left split that's starting to emerge in America. I'm sitting there, and Johnny can't even work at the McDonald's because of a variety of things, and I'm getting pissed. I want someone to blame. And we've been through this again in the South. We've been this, using as the villain of the piece. Well, it's because all those blacks and Latinos have affirmative action. That's why we can't get the jobs we used to have. And that kind of dynamic has dangers not only for blacks and Latinos. I think it has dangers for whether we can really come forward with a progressive agenda. And my concern that I'm starting to see is if we don't deal with the labor issue across the board, For people who are not on high academic tracks, we're going to have a divided country that's going to keep coming back to these simple, sort of over-the-top explanations of why things are wrong. And that's the kind of discussion I think we have to have seriously with American labor. And that's why American labor and progressives and those leading the Black and Latino community are going to have to press on a labor solution that is broad-based enough to allow us to get the political will to do something about it. So those kinds of discussions have to take place seriously if we're going to have any hope. The other thing we started to understand is, okay, I got big labor problems. What kinds of interventions can I come up with that might have a meaningful effort? So we started with Ways and Means because we had Charlie Rangel, having trouble now, who put into the stimulus bill a tax credit that would give a $6,000 incentive to private employers willing to hire young people out of work and out of school for more than 6 months. And that this is serendipity. I don't particularly have great records in getting bills passed, but this bill passed because it picked up on a concern both for the private sector having low margins and because we needed to do something here. That was well before the recession hit. The other is a bill that we worked with Jerry Nadler on introducing. This is sort of stimulus light. Essentially, Jerry and I were talking about the Disconnected Youth Report, and he recognized that there's another stimulus bill coming out, won't be called that. The Democrats and everyone else, the House and Senate, have to consider about a $500 billion program for infrastructure, transportation infrastructure coming up. Probably going to be put to the vote sometime 2010, 2011. Well, $500 billion is serious money. What Nadler has suggested is a WPA program before this one, which already has about 23 sponsors, that in the areas where these major projects are going on, that you're going to create WPA cores, working with young people who are disconnected to try to get them hooked up into these new projects. It has difficulties, and I should talk because I've talked to Ed Ott about this. We have some problems here that I think we have to be honest with, particularly with the labor community. Jerry checked with national labor and construction trades on this bill before he put his bill out. It was, again, at a time of relatively full employment. American labor, obviously, has not been universally open to blacks and Latinos coming into their ranks, particularly in construction trades. My father, I think, many years ago brought the first lawsuit against the sheet metal workers, and they're still under supervision now by the courts. That's not true as it once was to the same extent, but it's much more difficult to have these kinds of discussions in times when so many unionized workers are out of work. Nonetheless, we're going to have serious discussions of where the issue of American labor and out of work, low-wage blacks and Latinos fit together, because separated, they're not going to have the political clout to bring about what both of them need in terms of economic vitality. So I think those kinds of discussions are vitally necessary to have on a local level as to what is going to be the synergies between people representing out-of-work New Yorkers, particularly black and Latino individuals, and the American labor movement and the local labor movement. And I think it's a tough discussion, but it has to be had if we're going to have any success here. And the final thing we've been working on is something called Section 3. I've been looking for, if I can't get stimulus 2, what other sources of money are available? We have the largest public housing group in the country. I think the last budget for that was about $1.3 billion per year before stimulus. They received about $500 million in stimulus just for New York City last year. Section 3 was a provision put in a long time ago that each housing authority was to give first priority to residents and people in the surrounding neighborhood of public housing. Last year, $1.3 billion spent, 9 people were hired. Okay? We recognize that public housing, though maligned everywhere else in the country, is perhaps the best run public housing in the nation here, and literally provides more housing for low-income people than virtually anywhere else in the country. It's a city, bigger than Cleveland, just in our public housing. The amounts of money running through that run into the billions of dollars. The question we started to look at, how many people are actively in this age band, 16 to 24, who are actively looking for work in public housing? We came up minimally, pre-recession, 30,000 individuals in this category alone, and 9 people given jobs out of the Section 3 program. So, okay, I'm sort of a political hack now. What do I do about this? I've got a problem. I've got a law that's not being enforced, and I think we went at it as sort of a political operation. We went to Nydia Velasquez and Maxine Waters, who were holding hearings on the issue of public housing and public housing renewal, and they're in the process of strengthening Section 3 enforcement. So you need a stick. We went to the new head of public housing, very nice guy, to say, what are you doing about this? He said he didn't know about it, which is true. Virtually no one really pays any attention to this particular provision. He says, okay, I'll do it. I'll look into it, and we'll start to put some effort into it. And then we went to HUD and talked to Secretary Tresvina, who's used to head MALDAF, and he promised enforcement. You can start to piece these problems out and figure out, rather than throwing our arms in the air and saying there's nothing politically we can do about it. I think the interesting thing, it takes years, is to start to invest on things we do have levers on. We do have an enormously powerful New York delegation. Across the nation, there are so many legislators who have power that haven't exercised it effectively on behalf of their constituents. And there's also, I think, in taking the 32BJ issue, where we've worked very closely. The final issue really is what Stephen talked about, which is the issue of, once we get people back into the labor market, can they actually support their family? I mean, one of the dirty little secrets in New York, we had welfare reform. Essentially, poverty increased. We're up to 40,000 people now in homeless shelter. If you talk to them, these aren't welfare people anymore. These are the working poor. Our security guards, when we did focus groups, were saying, we were getting numbers of 20 to 30% of them were saying they were homeless during part of the year. These people are working harder than anybody else, and they're not making it. They have no health insurance. Only unionization for low-wage workers can move this along. Only. No individual can cope with a large bureaucracy alone. You cannot leverage it. I don't care how much people talk about it. This notion of not unionizing people in healthcare who are low-wage workers, security guards who are low-wage workers, has to be the paramount move if you care about this issue of Black and Latino low-wage individuals in New York City and any city in America. They've maligned it, just as they did so effectively on welfare. I mean, they started to picture all these, no one wants to work, they're sitting around. They've maligned the union movement just as effectively. And the difficulty is, I think, this racial issue, this wedge issue of older union members being fearful of change, has been used against us from reconnecting this kind of movement again. But I don't think either side can win here. I don't want a love fest. I've given up on that. I've dealt with all sorts of politicians. This is self-interest. The union movement can't get enough power unless it comes together with the aspirations of low-wage workers across the country. And together, this becomes a potent force. This can shake people, and this is why you start to see how virulent the attacks are on Working Families Party. I know these guys for a long time. But the virulence of the attacks are not because, we don't like how they've done their books. It's because what it represents. This merger of social policy and unionism was what drove a whole generation of our parents and grandparents into the middle class. and it's broken, and anytime they try to bring the two together, there are going to be really vicious efforts to break it apart. So I think these are the kinds of things that are going to have to be looked at as we talk about this connection of the incredible problems of the black unemployed and the black poor of the city of New York and of Chicago and LA, and the issue of where unionism fits into this whole matrix. So we're here. It's been a pleasure talking to you. But I think there's so much work to be done, and very rarely do you get an opportunity. This isn't the worst of times. I've seen worse times. But if we don't take the opportunity to make these mergers, I think the failure will be profound and much more serious in terms of a political setback, basically for working people, than we can ever imagine. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take questions, and we'll start with you, and then after that, we'll take them in groups of 2 or 3 to facilitate it. Please, sir.
My question to the panelists.
1 second.
What would you specifically ask Labor to do to move this issue?
Okay. I think, you know, I started to see it when we, you know, CSS is a, you know, do-good organization. We haven't worked particularly with labor. The power, however, of what 32BJ and others in the union movement are trying to do, what 1199 and the rest have tried to do around low-wage workers, and the power, the potential power of being able to organize locally in terms of moving the vote and starting to hold local officials accountable is, I don't think we've even scratched the surface. In my district, you know, look, my father was the first black assemblyman in central Brooklyn, and Shirley Chisholm came out of his club, and, you know, they created things, but it was built on a connection with labor. They had the infrastructure and organizational clout to drive out the hack politicians that were there that weren't serving the constituency. This is the nexus that can shake any politician in the state of New York and beyond. But unless it's effectuated, it's not going to happen.
I would add, unions have to become vibrant organizations, people. They can't be simply a collection of 10% of membership or 2% of membership. And, you know, folk are like 24-hour people, not just 9-to-5 people. And so part of what labor needs to do is connect with the other part of their members. I give examples. Back when Ron Dellums became mayor, I was head of one of the task forces there, and I was talking at a meeting of the chair of the task forces, and a woman, an older black woman, was there, and she was active, and she's doing youth stuff. I said, "Where do you work?" "I work in home cares." "Oh wow, you're an SIU, aren't you?" But she didn't lead that way. The whole kind of vibrant side of her was kind of ignored, and so to me, it's not a matter of simply kind of having this top-to-top hookup. Mm-hmm. It's really revitalizing unions. So also unions are really like community organizations in many ways that can support, you know, union folk who have problems with kids in school, union folk have problems in the neighborhood. So I think that's the key thing, because when you have that kind of holistic approach to the members, that's when you want to connect with community better, and then you have stronger organizations. And if you don't have that, you'll be cutting deals. And I said, you cut deals, no power, you get bad deals, y'all, in the day.
Yeah. I'm John Hyland from the Professional Staff Congress. Two aspects. One, in putting together the pieces to get the power to do the things that we're talking about, what's the relationship with the immigrant communities? How does that whole movement relate to the movement that we're talking about today? And secondly, how do we get the labor leaders, the offices, the people who control the resources, make the decisions, into rooms like this to hear these ideas? There's no knock on the folks who are here, but de facto, the folks who have the power and the resources are largely not here. How do we get them here?
Thank you.
I was told the power was going to be here to talk to me. That's why I came here. I thought the power was
Steve, we'll collect another question and then.
We'll take a couple questions and let you take them as a group if you don't mind.
My name is Neil Frumkin. I'm with the Retirees Association of Council 37. I wanted to talk about context a little bit, which Mr. Pitts had mentioned. It seems to me that for organized labor, a big part of context is essentially the historic compromise that was made between labor and capital to avert the, and this is something that Mr. Jones spoke about, the threat of revolution, essentially, that labor basically said we will be the junior partners, and it seems to me that that no longer exists, and that the labor movement is not respected for fulfilling a role the capital wanted. And it seems to me also that the height of, the struggle in the black community in the 60s, developing a lot of programs that have existed, was spurred by Watts, Detroit, Newark, New York, where rebellion was taking place. The question that I have is how can we deal with changing a paradigm in terms of context, understanding of the new context, both domestically and internationally, that so that people can organize and have people understand what's the root cause of what's hitting them over the head, whether they be black or white, employed or unemployed.
So the longer we take with preparatory remarks and questions, the fewer questions we can take. So those two questions.
It's wonderful not being an academic. I mean, I can. No, I don't mean to be. You know, I think the paradigm has shifted. Let me take this first. And part of it is globalization. When I was looking at the 50s and 60s, I lived through some of the riots there. The New York of that day had businesses that were really locked to this city. And I don't think that exists anymore. That if things become too disordered in New York City, people will pick up and move to the suburban ring. And you've seen this with other cities, where I think Detroit is now talking about actually downsizing its city, basically because it's dropped from 3 million people to 600,000 people or something crazy like that. So I think we have to recognize that certain of the levers are not there in terms of, well, we'll shake the roots of American capitalism. There are just too many countries in the developed world that people can go to. What's different, I think, is the latent political power here. And I think the Obama administration's existence, I think in some ways, was the coming together, perhaps, of a lot of different strains that were there already. Some of this was labor, some of this was black and Latino and immigrant communities coming together to say, we need some change here, this is getting too difficult. I think the fact that the coalition may not hold together as strongly is what I'm worried about, because as we found after elections of, certainly in the city of New York, after David Dinkins' election and then his loss the next term, was the fact that his own base didn't see the results of their vote. And it's one of the most difficult problems of non-voters, particularly young non-voters who come in, who vote once with great excitement, but don't see any kind of shift, nor is anyone trying to reach out to them to explain when the shift is going to come that would justify them getting, participating. And I'm worried the same thing may happen here, whether that's New Jersey's issue or whatever. I do think the question of, is the base going to be energized, because we've seen 10% unemployment. We've seen a statement basically that job creation is going to be limited. What's in it when I try to convince a young person we used to register through the black church particularly, when someone from the youth ministry says, well, we haven't seen anything in 4 years, we now have more unemployment than we did before, where's the beef here? And I think that's why it's so vital to start at least laying out and engaging on these issues quickly.
We had a convening out in Cal, some black browns. Well, out there we call it black brown. Here it's the same thing, right? But anyway, and one guy was there from the IF in North Carolina. He said something that was very important. that people don't live to fight. They live to go watch football, y'all. And they live to hang out with the kids and, and that sort of thing. And so I think, I say it because the issue is how do we reach folk where they are and help them change their world. That's a starting point. It's not a paradigm. It's not the kind of how to get so-and-so in the room necessarily. It's engage folk, because I think people are pragmatic. And if you engage folk, they know that they don't get the whole loaf in a day. The issue is when you don't engage folk, when you get folk psyched up for November 4th, then all of a sudden they go back to a bad job on November 5th. And so the issue is simply how do you engage folk on a regular basis. The idea of immigrants, I mean, folk are here. And once you engage folk, automatically you get folk involved. You kind of bridge those gaps. In terms of labor in the room, you gotta find kind of the scale where people can change their reality. And given that scale, you engage folk on that question. In other words, so Jerry doing Emerald Cities, it's a phenomenal idea to green the city. And when I read about kind of the vision of, for the building trades, this notion of really having a new social compact is incredible vision. But the important thing is that the local folk gotta buy into it. It can't be edict from DC that says you gotta engage in Emerald City, then it's all gets screwed up. But the idea is that if folk locally say, I wanna do that, and they see they can change their reality, then you can begin to have these transformative conversations and these transformative practices. We have a new reality. My concern with the paradigm issue is, I mean, I went around back in the good old days, supposedly, right? Back in the 30s and 40s, you had this new view of the world. I think the problem is that we view history through the books. And when I write the book, it'll be a glorious story, y'all, okay? It must be glorious. But in the real world, it's messy as hell, okay? Where you didn't have everybody fighting capitalism, they fought simply to kind of have a better life. And then, given that you had other kind of infusion of consciousness as well, I say it because it seems to me that folk had incredible power going to 48, didn't have enough power. And so the idea of kind of a deal that was cut back then, it wasn't simply because people weren't conscious, folk didn't have the power to go further, along with other stuff as well. So my thing is not so much an idea issue. The ideas are important. It's building the base to change what's possible. Because like I said, people want to simply watch football. And they want to kind of drink beer and those sort of things. And if all of a sudden they feel that they can't win those battles, they won't fight those battles. They'll go back to watching football and drinking beer.
Larry Parks is my name. I want to suggest something which may seem a little heretical to what you've presented, and then I want to ask you a question about what can be done.
But quickly.
Almost all the emphasis today has been on what government can do somehow in terms of policy. I just want to read you 3 sentences from a speech given by David Farr last week. David Farr is the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of Emerson Electric, one of the world's premier industrial companies, and he says, now, to tell you how bad this is, he's talking about policy in Washington having to do with jobs. He says, now to tell you how bad this is and tell you what I think Washington is doing now, Washington is doing everything in their manpower capability to destroy United States manufacturers, fundamentally destroy U.S. manufacturers. What do you think I'm going to do? And here's the key words. He says, I'm not going to hire anybody in the United States. I'm moving. That's my opinion as a manufacturer, and we employ 125,000 people. So the kind of jobs that we're talking about, I mean, the big employers, this is typical of how American industry looks at this. And if American industry is disenfranchised from hiring people, I can't really see how you're going to make any big progress. And what I'd like you to address, which has not been addressed, are the barriers to entry in the labor force. And today, for example, in this country, we have roughly 1,500 jobs where you need a license to get the job. Anywhere from shining shoes to picking out wallpaper to cutting hair. This is manifestly unfair. I want to know what you plan to do about that. And also, what can you do to eliminate other barriers to employment, of which there are many, in terms of laws, special taxes on employers that really make it expensive to hire people in this country.
We'll package that with one more back there. Hello?
Kate Bronfenbrenner, Cornell University. So I've been tracking race and race and organizing for 20 years, and both the race of who's being organized, but also the staff, and both of the organizers and lead organizers. And one of the things that the question it raises is that I think that unions really don't know who they're organizing. So you raise this question of they're putting their resources. A lot of them are putting their resources. They're targeting. They're not targeting black workers, but the majority of, because black workers are much more likely to win than white workers, the majority they're disproportionate. The new workers being organized are disproportionately workers of color, and so the more workers, an increasing number of black workers are coming in. Black women. Just more even than black men, but still black men are growing in numbers in the new workers being organized, and that's been happening in more escalating numbers in the last 20 years. But what's happened in hiring is that they are not increasing the number of organizers, and they're not promoting in leadership, and they're certainly not promoting in officers and staff higher up. And so by now, at this point, we have the new workers, the new members of unions are disproportionately people of color, growing and growing numbers of people of color. And I keep wondering at what point are they going to stand up and say, hey, there's something really wrong here, and because they haven't. And are they going to start voting people out of office? And the second point is that in the South, if I were to say that if there was anything that really went wrong that we can point to, is that black workers in the South really do vote union, but the reason the organizing hasn't happened in the South is because unions don't think that they can win in the South. But when they do organize in the South, they do win. And so the unions have this profound ignorance. They don't know this piece of information. They don't realize it. So the question here is when are black workers within the labor movement actually going to start to take this challenge and recognize that they're a much more powerful force within the labor movement than they realize, because they really are growing in numbers.
To the panel.
Well, let me start with the private employer issue, which I think is certainly one of the ones that I guess I'm pragmatic enough to recognize that there is going to continue to be outmigration of American jobs, likely to lower wage developing economies. The sort of benefits to businesses, even the perceived, trumps their interest in national will, and I recognize that's going to go on. Once having said that, I think what Obama did say, and which I think is right, that we have not done enough to incentivize private employers to hire the unemployed. I think there's much more that can be done. I mean, it's been fascinating to work with our tax credit idea because basically, particularly when I talk to smaller employers and mid-sized employers who hire most of the low-wage workers we're interested in, we are told almost inevitably that the paperwork burden makes it impossible for them really to make use of the tax credit. That the Marriotts of the world and some of the bigger PepsiCo, using housing tax credits, really have the infrastructure to provide for mid-sized and small employers who really might benefit, particularly unemployed poor workers, most of all. And my discussion has been with the New York City Chamber of Commerce and the rest, well, if that's just the problem, if this is a paperwork problem, we can fix that. If there's the tax credit has the money, and we just have to find vehicles to make sure the tax credit is like turning a switch, and you just don't have to do any paperwork, let's get that done. Let's fix that. I don't think, obviously, I'm not going to go along. We just had a major fight that we helped on paid sick leave for New Yorkers, which we support vigorously. We see this in the same light for both small and larger employers. because our polling results show that when people don't have sick leave, 70 to 80% go to work sick, and they're almost all in low-wage food handling. If you want this city, my founders, not a nice group, would have said you're out of your cotton-picking mind if you allow that kind of behavior to go on in New York business. This is like OSHA. We don't like people getting their fingers cut off by the food slicer. Same thing with, we don't want people with H1N1 virus to be coughing over the hamburgers and accept that as a support for American business. So I think we have to find this equilibrium here. But the notion of incentivizing businesses to do training, to do other supports, I think should be on the table. And basically, because of the way the country is going, it may be the one thing that actually gets some traction, in the short term at least, in American labor.
Some quick thoughts. So right now, the private sector has a secondary role in the recovery, in the conversation. Like I said, the problem is lack of demand. And if folk aren't buying, folk aren't going to produce, aren't going to hire. And so while we need to make sure that we don't have a lot of stupid stuff on the private sector phase of things, that's not going to lead the going forward. It simply won't happen. Won't happen. That's step one. Step two, and this is a larger conversation, kind of a friends conversation. We got to get away from this idea of a national context. You know, the nation state is an outmoded idea that doesn't fit today's reality or the future reality. To understand where our minds are today, that's not the reality today fully, it won't be the future as well. So somehow as we begin to talk about solutions, we can't angle them in kind of U.S. solution. I know we live here, y'all, okay, that's understandable. But the reality is that the borders are artificial. They're a function of power and politics, y'all, and old technology. And you have new technology. The world's different, okay? People are moving and stuff. And so somehow as we talk about how we go forward, we got to put in our heads somehow this notion that the boundaries are more fluid. Mm-hmm. Not saying we should ignore people's sense of themselves, and they do live in this country, okay? But we gotta have a little other way of looking at it, because otherwise we aren't gonna really solve the problems, because things are mobile. The last thing about when a black book is up, I mean tomorrow, okay? But seriously, Kate, some thought, you know more about this than I do, some quick thoughts. First of all, go back to scale once again. That it is difficult to organize, regardless of will, because of the nature of power and laws and those sort of things. So somehow we got to find a way to have a scale where folk can actually win. Because once again, going back to playing football or fighting, I'm going to play football and not fight. And so the idea of when black workers kind of whatever, you got to find ways that people can win victories. That's the important thing. So the whole idea of having like non-majority unions are important, where somehow you have ways folk can come together and maybe impact how the workplace is run, short of having collective bargaining agreements is important. So I would say step one is finding kind of a scale where people can fight and win. Without that, everything else won't happen. And then it's kind of having, once again, these conversations. I mean, I like revolutions too, y'all, okay? But we can't always throw bombs from the outside. We simply can't. And so somehow it's a combination of kind of the bomb throwing and the kind of massaging and some other stuff. It's all coming together because clearly we need people of color doing the organizing. That's kind of a given. That's kind of point Z. And we're at point A, how do you get there? And just saying has to happen to make it so. And so part of it is kind of the organizing from below and get people to be more involved in the scale they can win, so they will get involved. But also saying, wait a second, I mean, someone who's in charge, you're really stupid as hell, okay, and not being nice about it, and let's have a discussion over it. And so I think it's kind of both things. But the key thing, once again, people have to be mobilized. And they'll only mobilize if they see victory being possible. Otherwise, you get a small group of people. I mean, kind of a pet peeve I have about what's happening at UC Berkeley in California. I mean, people at UC Berkeley, they have 40,000 students out there, right? They're going to screw those students. But you have 60 folks taking over a building? Makes no sense, y'all. Makes no sense, okay? You got to engage folk in a broad scale. You really do, seriously. And so the issue is how to engage folk on a broad scale may not be our pace, but it's a winnable pace. And that's what I would say.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, and we can take no more questions. I am sure that I speak for, without authorization, for New Labor Forum and for the Murphy Institute in thanking Stephen Pitts and David Jones for an outstanding exchange this morning, and I hope that expresses your sentiment as well. This is Labor Breakfast Forum, and I think the two of you have given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much, and thank everyone for coming.